I have a disease that only allows me to remember one day at a time. Every day, my boyfriend would tell me that I am his beloved, until the day I saw him embracing another woman, a mischievous smile on his face. He wasn't afraid, knowing that she wouldn't remember anything, but what he didn't know was that I had regained my memory. When I woke up in the morning, a strange man held me in his arms. Before I could struggle, he, as if anticipating my reaction, said, "Nina, I am Charles." I stiffened. Looking up at him, he opened his eyes and met my gaze, still showing signs of just waking up. "You are my beloved. Have you forgotten me again?" He asked casually, lazily. I slowly let down my guard and asked, "Should I remember?" Charles sighed, rubbed his head for a few seconds, then sat up. His hair was tousled, but it didn't diminish his overall attractiveness. He reached for his phone, used my fingerprint to unlock it, and a picture of us together appeared on the screen. In the picture, I leaned on Charles's shoulder, smiling brightly, with the words "Nina will always love Charles" written underneath. I was somewhat surprised, as I didn't remember the scene nor any memories of Charles. Charles turned off the screen and threw the phone aside, then casually pulled me back into his arms and lay back down, speaking in a sleepy voice. "Be good, go back to sleep," he said. I couldn't fall asleep in Charles's embrace, so after he had calmed down, I carefully got out of bed. There was a small note by the bedside. "Don't forget Charles." I turned to look, and Charles was lying with his eyes closed, his brows slightly furrowed, sleeping restlessly, not only by the bedside, but small notes like this could be found all over the room. I leaned on the sink, lost in thought. After a while, a pair of hands suddenly rested on my waist. I looked up and saw Charles in the mirror, chin resting on my shoulder, his just awoken voice husky. "Nina, don't rush. I will always be with you," Charles said, repeating this rhythm every day, waking up, feeling lost, and slowly accepting him again. Charles would tell me like this every day, that he loved me. When Charles called me to have breakfast, I stood awkwardly in front of the table, saying, "I don't remember you." Charles paused for a moment, a wry smile appearing on his lips. Leaning on the table, he bent down slowly to meet my gaze. Those eyes and brows were extremely attractive, deep and focused when gazing at someone, indeed, the type I might like. "I remember you, Nina," Charles said softly. "You will get better." His words were comforting, but I could still see the melancholy in his eyes when he turned away. "Are you sad?" Charles held the milk, leaned his head to ponder for a moment. "How should I put it? I am getting used to this." He turned to me, sighed. "I just hope that one day you will wake up and remember me, even if it's just a name." Charles took me to the supermarket, then to a concert at night. He said that these were on my old wish list, and he would repeat these from time to time. Rubbing my head, he said, "Nina, you must get better soon." Under the street lights, Charles's expression was indulgent and hopeful, and I felt my chest pounding fiercely. "Charles," I asked, "did I perhaps really like you before?" Even in my state of amnesia, I could feel the intense affection for the man in front of me. Charles stopped in his tracks. He looked down at me, a hint of a smile on his face. Charles usually looked very good, but there was a mischievous air about him that was hard to pinpoint. After thinking for a moment, he calmly said, You pursued me for a whole 6 months before I agreed. Sometimes I even wonder if you are deliberately taking revenge. I will try to get better." I held his hand. "Charles, please wait for me a little longer." On the way back, a woman suddenly rushed up from around the corner. She was staggering, unable to walk steadily. Luckily, Charles reached out and steadied her before she fell. She had a pure face, turned to Charles and smiled. "Thank you." Charles also looked at her, and after a few seconds, he said in a deep voice, "You're drunk." "It's good to be drunk." The woman laughed. "At least no one cares about me. It's good to be drunk. It's good not to feel bad." For some reason, I sensed a subtle atmosphere between her and Charles. Charles held onto her arm tightly, not letting go, and after a while said, "It's not safe to drink so late at night. Go home early." The woman didn't reply but looked at me instead. "You are so lucky," she said. "My boyfriend doesn't want me." I was still confused, but I said truthfully, "If he doesn't want you, then you shouldn't want him either. There are plenty of men out there. No need to suffer." "Yeah." She suddenly became sarcastic. "How can a person who eats sugar taste bitterness?" Charles suddenly became impatient, released her hand, and said, "Nina, let's go home." When we got back, Charles didn't look well. He leaned on the sofa, holding a game controller making noise. After the TV screen went black, he complained impatiently, threw the game controller aside, and lay back. "What's wrong?" Sensing his emotional fluctuations, I approached him. Charles adjusted his mood, hugged me. "Nina, don't leave me. I really like you." I pulled away from his embrace and looked at him curiously. "Charles, that woman, do you know her?" Charles's expression changed, but he calmly said, "I don't know her. She was just drunk." Before I could speak, Charles leaned in to kiss me, murmuring, "Nina, don't leave me." When I woke up in the morning, my head was foggy. Charles had gotten up early that day, heard a noise, and walked over to stand by the door, looking at me. "Nina, good morning. I am Charles." I sat bewildered on the bed, watching Charles approach and gently say, "Have you forgotten me again?" As usual, he played a video for me, showing the two of us. I looked at him, not saying anything. He then led me to the table and handed me a cup of warm milk. There was a note on the table reminding me to eat on time and love Charles. Charles, in a soft voice, reassured me, "Don't be afraid, have breakfast first, I'll explain later." I sat at the table, holding the milk, slowly swallowing. My mind was in chaos. Before I could finish the milk, there was a knock on the door. Rhythmic and deliberate, 2 knocks together. Charles held the milk, his gaze heavy as he looked over at the door. The knocking continued. After a silent moment, Charles did not show any intention of opening the door or ignoring it. He seemed lost in thought, then turned and met my gaze. "Let me open it, Nina." I started to get up, but Charles pressed me back down. "I'll do it. You eat first," in a natural tone. He walked towards the door. The door was opened slightly, and I moved to see, behind the door, I saw a familiar face, the same woman from last night. My hand holding the milk trembled uncontrollably. Charles stiffened for a moment but quickly returned to his usual self. He smiled at me, with hardly any indication of any flaws. As if truly facing a stranger, I looked at the opening, emotions brewing inside me. After breakfast, Charles said he would cut some fruit for me. When he opened the fridge, it turned out there were no fruits. He put on his coat and went out. I walked to the window and looked down. Soon enough, Charles's figure appeared below. A few seconds later, another figure suddenly dashed up from the side, heading straight for Charles. Her target was obvious. Charles. I couldn't help but hold onto the windowsill tighter. Charles had obviously noticed her too, but he stood still without moving. The moment the girl was about to fall, her body stopped in midair. A pair of hands firmly grabbed her arm. Charles finally didn't let her fall to the ground. They were too far away for me to hear their conversation, but inexplicably, I felt that the girl's face was smiling at that moment. Charles came back, carrying a bag of fruits. He personally cut the fruit platter in the kitchen. From my perspective, his profile was smooth, his expression focused and serious. As if feeling my gaze, Charles looked up and smiled at me. While eating the fruit platter, I couldn't help but wonder, can the look of love be acted out? I couldn't tell. Today I was unusually quiet. Charles touched my forehead and asked if I was feeling unwell. I nodded lightly. He suddenly changed his expression, anxiously asking, "Where does it feel uncomfortable? Why didn't you tell me?" I touched my chest and looked at him. "It's stuffy here." Charles suddenly paused. "Charles, are you able to lie as well?" Charles looked at me in a daze, his eyes clear, reflecting my appearance. The room fell silent. Charles, being intelligent, countered, "Nina, did you see something?" "Don't overthink." He reached out to tidy my hair, speaking in a soft voice. "I know, but if you don't like it, I won't see her again. Is that okay?" "I didn't mean to hide it from you," he said so sincerely that I couldn't tell the truth in his words. At night, Charles stood by the bedside and turned off the lights. "Nina, it's time to sleep." I looked at him. "Aren't you sleeping?" Charles laughed at this question. "I still have work to do. You go ahead and sleep." Charles quietly closed the door and went to the living room. I lay awake in bed, tossing and turning. I only had memories of the past 2 days, and I didn't know anything. The reason for my amnesia was never mentioned by Charles, but my condition seemed to be slowly recovering. Yet, my heart was racing, feeling like I had missed something. After some time, I heard a knocking on the door. In the quiet night, it sounded particularly clear. Knock, knock, 2 sounds echoing. I suddenly opened my eyes, and the knocking disappeared in that instant. Instead, I heard the sound of the door opening and a clear female voice. "Charles." She had come again. I got out of bed and opened the bedroom door. Charles was no longer in the living room. There were several cigarette butts in the ashtray. His phone lay on the table, the screen still lit. I glanced at it. There were a dozen missed calls and dozens of text messages. The latest one was from 10 minutes ago. "That's why I'm coming to find you." The room wasn't soundproof, and I stood in the living room, listening to the voice coming from the corridor. "Charles, why are you ignoring me?" "Tiffany." In a low voice, Charles replied, "I told you not to come. Why?" "Be quiet. She has trouble sleeping." "But I'm having trouble sleeping." "Charles," her voice was sweet and sugary, with a hint of coquettishness, "can you help me sleep?" "Tiffany." I walked to the door and quietly opened it. They were standing in the dimly lit corridor. The night had turned cold, but Tiffany was dressed thinly. She looked up at Charles, repeating with each word, "I can't sleep." Charles stood in front of her, holding a cigarette, saying nothing. After a long pause without a response, Tiffany nodded knowingly. "Then I'll go have a drink." She turned to walk back, but was caught by the arm. Charles, with a sense of urgency, said, "I told you, it's not safe to drink at night." Tiffany turned back, giggling. "Why do you care about me?" "What about your Nina?" She suddenly pointed at me, meeting my gaze with a challenging look. Charles froze for a moment, then let go of her arm and turned to look at me, his face paling. He brought me back to the room and closed the door with a slam, shutting out Tiffany's laughter. He looked at me, completely at a loss. He held my hand and asked, "Nina, are you feeling cold?" I calmly looked at him. You said you wouldn't see her. I didn't want to see her. Charles lowered his voice. I really haven't contacted her. She's just a friend. What kind of friend? Charles fell silent. The night ended in discord, and the next day, Charles didn't mention what had happened the night before. The events of the previous night seemed buried with yesterday. For Charles, it was a new day. He continued to introduce me to things day after day, never tired of saying he loved me. However, Tiffany didn't remain in the past. She started appearing in their daily life. She would bring breakfast every morning, wait downstairs for Charles during rubbish disposal, and forcefully hold his hand. I watched Charles's figure standing by the window and couldn't help but tug at my lips. In a split second, many scenes flashed through my mind, but they passed by so quickly that I couldn't make sense of them. I covered my head and squatted down, breathing slowly until my thoughts steadied. Standing up again and looking down, I saw no sign of Charles. He would come back as usual and tell me he loved me. He would continue to do every little thing attentively, and even the details that I didn't notice would be taken care of meticulously. He would rub my head, telling me we had many years ahead of us. But he couldn't bring himself to leave Tiffany waiting alone downstairs in the late hours of the night. He would go the extra mile to make things I wanted to eat at night. He even put the tiny paper star Tiffany gave him in a prominent place in the kitchen. Charles loved me deeply in the times without Tiffany. I watched Charles anxiously bustling around whenever I coughed and saw his furrowed brow when I was upset. Suddenly, I felt confused. Can you love two people at the same time? The morning wind was cold that day. Tiffany stood with breakfast, wanting to enter the room. Her voice was very protective, just like her appearance, innocent yet invasive. Charles, it's really cold today. My hands are freezing red. Let me warm up. Inside the bedroom, I heard Tiffany's voice seeping through the door crack. All of Charles's interactions with her were downstairs. This was the first time he hesitated. He remained silent for a while and slightly opened the door, only for 10 minutes. Don't say anything reckless, Tiffany pouted, but thankfully didn't argue. Charles handed me the juice as usual. Since Tiffany started bringing breakfast, the hot milk was replaced with juice. Charles softly reminded me, be careful not to spill it. The subtle fragrance of oranges wafted towards me, but I didn't drink it. My gaze fell on Tiffany sitting on the sofa. Charles followed my gaze, with no emotional reaction in his eyes. He casually said, she's here to pick something up and will leave soon. Hello, Tiffany. Tiffany tilted her head and said to me, I'm Charles's friend. She paused deliberately before the word friend, as if savoring the time the word lingered. Her features were too clean, and her words sounded so innocent and pure. She leaned on the sofa, as if she were in her own space. I knocked over the juice with a blank expression. Charles turned around. Nina? I said the juice tasted strange and that I couldn't drink it. I went back to the room and crouched down, holding my head. While listening to Tiffany's provocative tone, I seemed to recall many scenes. The image of Charles feeding Tiffany cake, the moments Charles and Tiffany locked eyes, Tiffany hugging Charles from behind, pleading softly not to leave. I felt like I needed to pause for a while to let my memory fully recover. I needed to know how much Charles had hidden from me. The knocking on the door grew more urgent each time, until he finally unlocked it with a key, fear in his voice. Charles asked, Nina, what's wrong? I took a moment to look up at Charles and said, I don't like juice, I want yogurt. Without a word, Charles went downstairs to buy it. Before leaving, he gave Tiffany a meaningful glance, indicating she shouldn't talk carelessly. Tiffany sat leisurely, sipping the juice. After finishing it, she took out a piece of candy from her pocket. She stared at me, slowly tearing open the candy wrapper and popping it into her mouth. The crisp sound of teeth meeting the candy reverberated in the room. She licked her lips and dropped the candy wrapper on the ground. It was very sweet. Do you want some? But I only have one, sorry. As if afraid Tiffany would say something, Charles came back quickly. He was carrying yogurt, slightly out of breath. Nina, I got you the yogurt. I shook my head, not wanting to drink it. Charles fell silent for a moment, placing the yogurt on the table. It's okay, you can drink it later, he said, naturally and indulgently. Tiffany, however, changed her expression, annoyed. She turned her head away, making a strange scoffing sound. Looking at her, Charles said, you may leave now. Tiffany's visits were becoming more frequent. I could clearly feel a change in Charles's feelings towards her. Perhaps Charles had feelings for her all along, which is why he allowed her to appear time and time again. They were freely intimate at home under the guise of being friends. Tiffany would greet me politely in front of me, but behind my back, she would subtly touch Charles's clothes with her fingers. I even saw her feed Charles a piece of cantaloupe in the kitchen. Charles did not refuse. He just frowned slightly but still ate it. I quietly turned away and walked to the bathroom, feeling sick to my stomach. As my memories slowly returned, I realized that my liking for Charles was a well-known fact among the people I met in college. How much did I like him back then? I liked him so much that I would leave school in the middle of the night just to bring him a bottle of drink in the arcade. Every word he spoke would brighten my day. It was a pure liking, wanting to be good to that person. My efforts were not in vain, as Charles gradually started to like me back, even more than I did. We got together. He would wake up early to prepare a loving bento for me. Even though it looked terribly ugly, he proudly announced my presence, wanting everyone to know that I was Charles's girlfriend. I never missed his plans. He seemed like a perfect boyfriend, flawless. I thought we would always be together, until Tiffany appeared. At the moment she appeared, I did not notice Charles's gaze. If I had been paying attention, I could have seen the different emotions in his eyes. Tiffany was his first love from a young age. Perhaps out of guilt, Charles became even more attentive towards me. However, I kept my distance from him for unknown reasons. Every time he approached me, my disgust would intensify. Charles's gaze towards me became more hurt and desolate. Sometimes he would sit across from me, looking at me, but not daring to come closer. He would say, "Nina, your condition seems to be worsening. Can I hug you?" His tone seemed to sink into despair. I did not respond, perhaps due to my withdrawal. Charles's relationship with Tiffany became closer. He transferred all his unfulfilled emotions onto Tiffany. Tiffany appeared and disappeared for a while. Each time she returned, I could feel Charles's fluctuating emotions. Charles was probably starting to like her for real. What surprised me was that Charles's love for me did not diminish at all. He was still attentive and caring towards me. When Tiffany returned again, Charles hesitated for a moment. When he received her call, Tiffany could now come and go freely. Her attitude towards Charles suddenly cooled down. Compared to before, she now seemed to consider him as a backup plan. Charles would no longer outright reject her. One evening, Tiffany's behavior took a new turn, and Charles allowed her more opportunities to be taken care of. While eating an orange, I suddenly burst into laughter. Both of them looked at me. "Charles, is she your sister?" I asked. Perhaps my tone was too assertive, and Charles suddenly became flustered. He quickly composed himself and mumbled, "The neighbor's sister, Nina. What about you?" He was testing the waters. I remained silent. Charles now seemed afraid that my memory might return. I watched them in the kitchen. Tiffany looked exceptionally sexy tonight, creating a stark contrast to her innocent face. She flirted with Charles, dodging his attempt to hand her the orange. Charles cleared his throat and then grabbed Tiffany's arm, pulling her closer. They were very close, their eyes meeting. Charles lowered his voice. "Tiffany, stop provoking me." Tiffany's smile widened. She enjoyed Charles's proximity. "Do you know how your Nina feels about this?" I gazed quietly at the man not far from me. In front of me, he played the loving boyfriend, but behind my back, he tightly held another woman. He was well aware that I only had a day's memory. Whatever he said or did, I would not remember. Holding Tiffany tighter, he looked down at her. Finally, he let out his restrained emotions and whispered, "She won't know. She won't remember." Tiffany's smile became even more cheerful. I watched this scene vividly, but what he didn't know was that I had recovered my memories. I loosened my fingers, and the glass slipped from my hand, creating a piercing sound. Both Charles and Tiffany turned to look. Before they saw me, I quickly averted my eyes. Charles rushed out of the kitchen, anxiously checking if I was hurt. Sometimes, men can be terrifying creatures. They stand before you, but you can't tell if they are being genuine or acting. Right now, Charles's worry was genuine, as was his fear of me getting hurt. If it weren't for seeing it with my own eyes, I probably wouldn't have believed that the words he just said came from the same man who was so devoted to me. I stared at him blankly. "Are you very worried?" "What are you talking about?" Charles furrowed his brows. "Are you hurt anywhere?" I shook my head. Charles finally sighed in relief and cautioned me to be careful in the future. Tiffany also walked out, watching Charles's back from the kitchen doorway and then shifting her gaze reluctantly. Her possessiveness towards Charles was gradually increasing. All my memories had returned. It seemed like infidelity was inevitable in their lives. There is a saying, there is zero chance of cheating. But before any real trouble occurred, I discovered what was going on between Charles and Tiffany. It was just that my emotions were too intense that night, leading to an accident when I drove out, resulting in temporary localized amnesia. After I had the accident, Charles cut off contact with Tiffany. He probably really wanted to reconsider our relationship, but it didn't last long. Tiffany's repeated appearances shook his resolve. My illness also became Charles's shield. If I hadn't regained my memory, how long would Charles have planned to hide things from me? How far would their relationship have progressed? I didn't know, nor did I want to know. The feelings of this past year now seemed laughable to me. That evening, Charles went to find her again. I went out alone, walking under the streetlights, pondering many things, from the beginning of our acquaintance to our courtship to being together. The late night was especially conducive to reminiscing. When exactly did Charles start to change? Was it from the moment Tiffany first appeared, or when Tiffany used the excuse of a class to bring him water? Do images of her unconsciously creep into his mind when he is with me? I didn't even know when he added her contact information. One evening when I was out for a walk one day, I suddenly saw a notification pop up on my phone. Tiffany said, "Thank you." At that time, I didn't pay much attention to it, but looking back now, everything seems to make sense. Does Charles love me? Or is it more a sense of guilt? He shamelessly deceived me, professing his love for her right in front of me, under my nose. When Charles came back, we bumped into each other on the street. He was carrying my favorite snacks and waved at me. He scolded me for sneaking out and asked me to stay home obediently and wait for him. Before he left, he mentioned that he was going out to buy snacks for me. I looked down at the bag of snacks, smiled at Charles, and said, "I seem to remember something." The bag dropped to the ground. Charles stood frozen in place, his voice trembling as he asked, "Nina, what did you say?" "Charles, I remember." I stared at Charles and said word by word, "I think I remember now." Charles's expression instantly became uncertain, and he stared at me blankly. His gaze contained several complex emotions, his voice unsteady, asking, "Remember what?" I smiled and said, "Today is our 100-day anniversary, Charles." Charles was stunned for a moment. 100 days? The time when Charles loved me the most, and I loved him the most. Charles looked at me with a gaze full of emotions, as if those moments had truly come to pass. A slight smile appeared on his lips as he softly promised, "I will love you for a long time." Charles became increasingly attentive to me. He wouldn't even let me go to heat the water alone. As I sat on the balcony in the sun, I would occasionally think of the past. Charles was trying to be the person from his past. I would stare at him, repeating "I love you" every day. He seemed to genuinely believe it. One cloudy day, Tiffany came. Even before Charles could open the door, I had already opened it. Leaning against the doorframe, I looked at her. "Who are you?" Tiffany stood at the door, utilizing her charm with a faint smile, politely mentioning that she had something to discuss with Charles. I called for Charles and asked, "Who is she?" without much familiarity. Charles hesitated, saying Tiffany was just a friend. "How come I don't recognize her?" Charles visibly hesitated. Tiffany was not present in the memories of the 100 days. "I'm not very familiar," Charles stammered. Tiffany's face changed. She tried to enter as usual, but I stopped her. "Charles, I'm firm. I don't know her, so she's not allowed into our home." After a moment of silence, Tiffany's face turned pale. For some reason, she insisted on entering, with Charles blocking the door. The two of them engaged in a conversation, but Tiffany's face became increasingly displeased. In the end, they parted ways unhappily. Tiffany left dissatisfied, and Charles seemed to be in a bad mood as well. I lay on the sofa nonchalantly and took a sip of my drink. In the evening, Charles made an excuse to go out. Before leaving, as I clung to his arm, I told him I was afraid to be alone at home and asked him to return early. Charles's expression softened, and he patted my head, saying softly, "Nina, wait for me. I'll be back soon." I let him go. It started to rain outside. Charles was gone for a long time, and I dozed off for a moment waiting for him to return. The next moment, a message came through on my phone. Charles said, "A friend is in trouble, so I won't be coming back." I held onto my phone and remained silent for a moment, then replied with 5 words, "I have a headache." Charles immediately called, but I didn't pick up. I bought a small cake and candles from the convenience store, lit them with a lighter, and recorded a video. Under the dim yellow light, the flames flickered gently. Facing the screen, I squeezed out a smile. "Charles, today is your birthday." I went downstairs to buy a cake, but the bakery was closed. "I only bought this. Where did you go? Why aren't you back yet? My head hurts, and my phone is dead. The power is out at home. Where are you?" After sending these messages, I turned off my phone. Charles came back soon, drenched from the rain. Even his forehead was wet. He pushed the door open and met my gaze on the sofa. I held the cake and looked over. It took me a while to mutter, "Why did you come back so late?" The hallway light seeped in, and Charles frowned slightly. He took a deep breath and walked towards me, enveloping me in his arms. "Sorry, Nina, no more next time." I made Charles blow out the candle. I told him it was the first birthday I celebrated with him. His guilt was about to overflow. While he was cutting the cake, I discreetly looked at my phone. Tiffany had sent a bunch of messages. As soon as she called him, I silenced my phone and tucked it into the sofa cushion. Once done, I caught Charles's eye. His eyes were full of warmth, and he repeated, "We will have many more birthdays together in the future." I nodded gently. Charles seemed to truly believe that. That day, Charles was trying to be very close to me. He hadn't contacted Tiffany since that day. I secretly checked his phone, and Tiffany's contact had mysteriously been added to the blacklist. In the kitchen, Charles was diligently preparing dinner for me. I left my phone on the sofa, chuckling somewhat sarcastically. Tiffany came back again. This time, her face no longer held the lighthearted expression. She asked Charles what he meant. Charles blocked the door and glanced at me. "It's nothing. Don't contact me anymore in the future." "Don't contact me?" Tiffany was incredulous. "Then what was all this just now?" "I told you before, Nina is my girlfriend." Charles's voice carried a hint of impatience. "Don't come looking for me anymore." What about the idea that you wanted to break up with her before and be with me? Was that a lie too? Tiffany, stop it. Charles's voice lowered. Nina is sick, and I won't leave her. I just want to take care of her properly. Tiffany became emotional, choked up. Then what about me? Tiffany and Charles had a heated exchange, using both hard and soft tactics. Charles was not a faithful man, and I understood that. I watched the two of them downstairs in silence, biting down on a piece of candy in my mouth. Tiffany liked to come around in the evenings. The timing was almost always fixed. In the evening, I persuaded Charles away from the neighborhood to buy things. Charles hesitated a bit before deciding that he wanted to eat. I wanted, okay, wait here a moment, Nina. In the end, Charles went out. Just as he left, I put on Charles's coat and started walking down. Just as I reached the gate of the neighborhood, Tiffany approached from the other side. She stared at the coat I was wearing and her expression suddenly changed. After all, it was a coat she had given Charles. I sent a message to Charles. A girl is coming to see you. Charles, she looks fierce. Just as I sent it, I suddenly noticed Tiffany walking towards me. She looked at the coat, chuckled, and said, "This coat looks familiar. My boyfriend has one too. What a coincidence." I chuckled back and said, "This one is my boyfriend's too? Your boyfriend?" Tiffany muttered these words, coldly chuckling. She looked me up and down, her eyes filled with provocation. "Forgetting to introduce you, my boyfriend's name is Charles." I remained still, slightly stunned. Tiffany smirked. "You probably don't know, but your boyfriend likes me, doesn't he?" I furrowed my brows. What nonsense. Does Charles only love me? Love you? Tiffany laughed. Is it love or guilt? Can you tell the difference? Of course. Before I could finish, she suddenly reached out and ripped the coat off me. Holding the coat, she looked at me condescendingly. "You're not suited to wear this." Enraged, I slapped her. The crisp sound echoed as she was pushed to the side. She stood motionless, unable to react or notice the figure that was swiftly approaching from behind. My fingers tingled from the slap. As I watched her, I don't believe it. Charles loves only me. He told me he wants to marry me. I trust him. Tiffany's breathing quickened, and she jerked her head. I loathe you. Charles only loves me. He said he wanted to marry me. I assured her. Tiffany's breathing became rapid, and she lowered her head, muttering a curse. Just as she was about to raise her hand, she felt her arm being grabbed. Sensing something, she turned to see a cold, distant face behind her. Charles dragged me behind him, his voice trembling. "Who asked you to come?" Tiffany turned red on the spot. "I can't come?" "What did you tell her?" Charles seemed truly furious this time, clutching my hand firmly. That night, I made it clear, I love Nina. From now on, it's her. Don't disturb us anymore. Tiffany's face turned white, staring at Charles before choking out, "Can you really forget me? Is it because of guilt that you're with her? You love me most, don't you?" Charles stepped back with me, calmly stating, "You're thinking too much." Clarity came to Tiffany as she let out a cry. Charles brought me back into the room, shutting the door behind him. "Who is she?" "An ex-girlfriend, but we've long been separated." Charles muttered a lie. "Is she bullying you?" "Nina, I'm sorry. I won't let her appear again," he added. "Please don't overthink it, believe me." Okay, when Tiffany came back for the last time, she was much calmer, without hysteria or nonsense. She just stared at Charles wordlessly for a long time. "Do you really no longer love me?" "Charles, one last time, I just need one sentence." Holding a cigarette, Charles replied without hesitation, "Yes, the only person I'll love from now on is Nina." Tiffany gazed at him stubbornly, refusing to cry. After a long silence, she gritted her teeth and said, "Then I sentence you. You'll never have me again." Tiffany left. For a few days after she left, she unexpectedly sent Charles a text message. Charles was in the shower, and I glanced at his phone. Tiffany had written a long message. I took a quick look, feeling somewhat surprised. Tiffany was giving Charles one last chance. 3 days later at the Civil Affairs Bureau entrance, if Charles didn't show up, she would choose a man 10 years older than her to marry. I stared at the screen, silently chuckling. Women in love were the most foolish when they used self-harm as leverage in hopes to win back a scoundrel. I grabbed my phone and responded with 4 words. "Congratulations on your wedding," followed by blocking that number. Tiffany did get married. I was finding it hard to keep up the act. With no contact between Tiffany and me, Charles had been more perfect than when we first got together. He truly remained loyal to our relationship, and that evening, I told him that we should get married next month. Excitedly agreeing, he moved to kiss me, but I moved away. I had been using the excuse of feeling unwell to reject his advances. He was always respectful, never crossing the line. Charles couldn't bear to be without me. He had truly fallen in love with me. A wanderer turning back. It was rare to witness. Charles had been acting strange these days. When I pushed open the door, the room was pitch dark. Suddenly, a faint light began to shine, and then one by one, the candles were lit. Many people popped up in the room, some familiar faces, all of them Charles's friends. In the candlelight, Charles walked towards me, his eyes filled with happiness. He crouched down, one knee on the floor, slowly opening a box, looking at me with devotion and sincerity. "Nina, will you marry me?" Cheers erupted around the room, echoed one after another. I took the ring, but before Charles could rise, I tossed it out the door. The ring made a soft sound as it hit the ground, drowning out the cheers in the room. Everyone froze. The silence felt eerie. Only the flickering candles broke the stillness. I stared at Charles, enunciating each word clearly. "Charles, let's break up." His face turned pale in an instant, his voice trembling. "What?" "Let's break up." I spoke clearly, staring at him, enunciating each word clearly. "We are over." I had left the memories of when we truly loved each other. I played the role of someone deeply in love with Charles. I wanted him to fall in love with me again in this atmosphere, and then break him when he loved me the most. I had succeeded. Charles looked as if he had gone mad. He held my hand, his breath unsteady. "Nina, don't do this." I didn't say anything that night, but slowly pried open Charles's fingers. I left without another word. After that day, Charles tried to reconcile with me frequently. He couldn't understand why we had broken up like this. He blocked me as I tried to leave, Charles's eyes brimming with regret. "Nina, why are we breaking up? Did I do something to upset you? Was the proposal too sudden? But you said you wanted to marry me that night. Let's try again. You don't officially say we broke up properly." He struggled to find any excuse to reconcile. I leaned in, watching him panic, slightly curling my mouth in scorn. "Do you want to know the reason?" "Yes, it's simple. I'm tired. Please don't come to me again." Charles's eyes gradually dimmed, and he hesitated to say, "Am I wearing you out?" I responded casually and swiftly, "Exactly, Nina. You're so cruel." Charles laughed, slightly hurt. "That's not funny," he said. "Don't leave me, please." He touched his chest. "It hurts here. It hurts so much. Can't get a good night's sleep, right?" I squeezed past him. "But what does it have to do with me?" "But adding a few missing paragraphs to the translation would most certainly exceed the word limit. Would you like me to include a certain section within the word limit, or should I proceed with the current translation? During that time, didn't you really feel it?" I have never been so humble to ask someone. "Nina," he looked up at me, his voice almost in the dust. "Can you give me another chance?" I turned and walked away elegantly. "Nina." Charles stepped forward and grabbed my wrist. "Can you really forget about me? Please give me another chance. Don't leave me." I called the police. Before leaving, I flipped off the Charles in the police station. After leaving the station, I went to the mall, planning to pick out a necklace, but then suddenly bumped into Tiffany. Compared to Charles's changes, she was even more significant. In a short period, her original appearance was no longer recognizable. She seemed to have aged significantly, quickly becoming someone unrecognizable. Later, I found out that Tiffany didn't marry the man 10 years her senior solely because of Charles. It was because of his wealth. She fell for that, but only found out the truth when she became pregnant. The so-called wealth was just an illusion, and now everything was falling apart for her. She seemed to notice me, and her gaze avoided mine. Before I could go over to say hello, she was forcefully taken away by the person next to her. It seemed like her life wasn't going well. I smiled contentedly. Charles began to appear frequently. He changed his tactics, from persistent pursuit to silent care. He would deliver food to me in the morning, bring me a flower in the evening, and go as far as running halfway across the city to buy me my favorite food. He was now using the same methods I had used to pursue him before. He begged for another chance, the last one. He promised not to let me down again. He wrote a long apology letter, but I didn't open it. Instead, I tossed it into the trash. When I looked up again, I met his wounded gaze. He forced a smile and waved at me. "Nina, good evening." Charles was more persistent than I had imagined. He even tattooed my name on his body, but I was already fed up with seeing him. The hurt I had experienced during that time couldn't be easily mended with a few words of apology. I admit I was at fault, but I truly knew I was wrong. Charles' eyes were red. He held me tightly, his voice breaking. "I really wanted to marry you, Nina. Please, can you give me another chance?" I didn't push him away, but after a long silence, I whispered in his ear, "This Saturday. Wait for me here. I'll consider it." Charles couldn't articulate his words. After a long silence, he nodded. "Nina." I cut in. "Let's talk about it then." On that Saturday, it started raining in the morning. By noon, it was pouring. When I arrived at the station, I noticed that Charles had made several calls. I didn't say anything. I turned off my phone, threw the SIM card out of the window, and left the city. I moved to a coastal city, one that I had always loved. I don't know how long Charles waited that day, but it didn't matter to me anymore. When I had some free time, I enjoyed sitting on the beach, quietly listening to the sound of the waves, taking a Deep breath. This relationship, back and forth, had occupied my youth. When memory resurfaced, I had thought about breaking up right away, but I chose to keep it hidden. If he broke up with me, Charles still had someone else to turn to. I didn't believe I was someone who could graciously wish others well. I wanted him to remember me vividly when I left. I wanted him to fall from his highest point. So when I left, I sent both Charles and Tiffany a gift. Tiffany had chosen to marry someone unsuitable. In a fit of anger, post-marriage life wasn't great. As for Charles, it seemed like someone had drained his soul, leaving him listless all day. Breaking away from Charles felt like escaping a bitter sea. I traveled to many places, to experience, to see scenery I had never seen before. I found happiness and solace from the depths of my heart. Life is long. I want to start over and embrace the life that belongs to me, starting from now.